Welcome to this BlazeMeter test data orchestration session. We're going to look at how we can use functional tests with test data orchestration. Now, what is test data orchestration? It's a component of BlazeMeter that allows you to not just generate the test data, but also then pass that test data to systems over an API. And why is that important? So if you look at our example here, now we're going to have a user called Joe, and we're going to use that user to log in and test our application. Now we could generate Joe using our synthetic data generation rules, but we need to make sure that Joe also exists in multiple places inside the application, perhaps in databases, perhaps in mock services. And that's the challenge of keeping that consistency in our system under test. So if you look at our example, in the table on the left, this is the data that we can generate. We're going to generate the name, the birth date, and the password. But if we were to run this test to just try and log in, obviously this user does not exist in our database. So the test won't work. So the other option is, no, perhaps we could take that data and inject it directly into the database. But that gives us challenges because generally developers are not always aware of the schema of the database, may not have access to the database. And quite often, a way to actually inject data into the database is via the application. So what we can do is take this data that we're going to generate, use the application's API to push the data into the application, which would then populate the database. Now, what this also does is gives us the option to take any responses that come back from that action and use it in our data model. So if you imagine in this case, we're going to create a user, we're going to get a response back from that request, and that response will contain the IDs. We can take that response and incorporate it into our data model. So at runtime, what we now have is all the data required for the test, and that same data has already been populated into our system under test. So let me show you this in a demonstration. So we're in BlazeMeter, we've got our test, and the test is 4 steps. We're going to log in, we're going to check the profile matches the logged in user, reload the data and log out. So if we look at the login process, as you can see, we're going to go to the login page, we're going to enter the user, enter the password, and the profile, we're then going to take the first name and the last name and check that it matches what's on the profile screen once you've logged in. Now this data is coming from our data model. So if we look at our data model, you can see here we've got our first and last name, and over here you'll see our first and last name. So we're using rules to generate realistic first and last names. We then combine those to make an email address, which is our logged in user, and also we've got a rule to generate the password. So if I look at this data here, we can see we've got first name, last name, we've got the date of birth, and if we scroll over, we've also got things like the email address. So all this data is being synthetically generated. If I change this to say I want 15 records, we now get 15 records. Change it back to 10, we get 10. So basically, on demand, we'll generate this data. So this is part of BlazeMeter's test data system. And if we look at an example of a test that's already run, what we can see is here's our test. If we look at the results screen, we can see that this user, Eliza, was generated by our system along with a password. If we play the video, we can actually watch this test running. So that's the user and details being added in. We then go to the profile screen, we match that is correct, and then we log out and that test completes. Now, this relies on the fact that that user, Eliza, existed in the database, and this is where the test data orchestration comes in. So if we go back to our test, and we go back to our data model, the second step we have is, as well as generating the data, we have our test data orchestration. So let's go to our test data orchestration, which is just here. So these 2 steps are 2 separate orchestration jobs. We're going to look at the one for creating a user. These are the 3 steps we actually need to go through the steps of logging into the application to get a token. We then need to actually inject the data into our application and obviously retrieve the ID. So the first step is fairly easy. We're going to pass in the username and password. On the response, we can then take the response from the JSON with the auth token and set it to a variable. Now, as you can see here, we can also do things with XML, we can do things with regex, we can also look at the header as well as the body of the response. We can also define failure assertions. So what happens when you get a different response? So if we look at our response codes here, we could say that if we got a 201, we actually want to exclude that data from our test. So this means that you can actually do things more than just posting data. We could do a get based on the response you get back. Now, do we use that record in our test or not? Now, I mentioned that we're getting the auth token. On the second step, what we can then do is pass that as a variable. So in this second step, we're going to take the variable from the first step, and in the body of our API called here, as you can see, this is the body of all the data to create the user. And all of these are the variables of the data. So the data we looked at just a minute ago when we were parameterizing our test, we've taken this model and we've included it in the body of our test. This will then run, create the user, and based on the response, we get back the ID. And again, we then make that a variable. So we take the response from the request to create the user, we make the ID a variable. The third step is just a validation where we're just going to actually pass the ID to make sure we get back the right data. We've now created that user. And this will be done at the start of the test. So at test execution, we're going to create this user. We'll then run the test. And after the job is completed, we can then do a delete. So in the same way as we did our create, we have a step which is going to log in and get us a token. We then have a step where we just pass the ID that we created at the start of the test. We can pass it as a delete to the API and remove that user from the application. So we can inject a user at the start of the test, use the user for testing, and at the end of the test, remove that user. So if we go back to the test and we scroll down, what we can also see, we have the location where the test will run, the browsers we want to use for our test, and also in the test data orchestration section, there's a select box for each of those orchestration jobs. So we can choose to enable or disable these orchestration jobs per test as required. So before we start the test, let's look at how many users we have in our system under test database. So we have 161 users, and these are the 12 most recent registered. We'll come back to this screen once we've started the test. So we're going to go back to BlazeMeter and just initiate the test. Now what's going to happen is during this boot phase, we're provisioning the environment to run all the tests. We're also generating that test data, so going through the test data rules to create the test data we need, and then calling the orchestration to publish that data into the application server so we can use it as part of our test. So here, we just run that command again. You can now see we've got 171 users, so we've generated 10 new users. These are the 10 users, and what we'll see is when this test runs, these are the users we're going to use for our test. So let's go back to BlazeMeter. So our test is completed. If we look at the login, we can see the user we used was Maria. So if we look at our SQL list, we can find Maria on the list. That was the user we just created. So that user has been created as part of our test data orchestration. And if we then look at the actual test itself, we look at the profile, we can see we did an assert. So if I just click on here, we can actually look at those assertions. And that's the screen. And we can see that we're actually logged in and we've checked that user does exist in the application, which is why the test is completed. Now, if we go back to our summary, we'll see the test is still running. These are the other iterations. So each line is another iteration. We wanted 10 users, so we're testing 10 users. And if I click on the show test data, so here's the test data. You can see our first name and last name that were used in the test. All the data here has been generated using generation rules, but you can also see in the ID column, what we've also got is the ID that we got back from the test data orchestration when we created the new user. So these IDs are the IDs from the application server. And if we just look at that query again, you can see this is the content of our application server. That's the ID and that's the name. And you can see that how this data here was generated by synthetic rules, and the ID was actually generated from the application server and is now included as part of our test data that we use during the testing. I hope you enjoyed that demonstration of the test data orchestrator. You can find out much more about BlazeMeter and test data, as well as the test data orchestrator, at blazemeter.com. We have blogs and videos, and at BlazeMeter University, lots of free courses. Thank you.